I went trawling the internet, I've done the research so you don't have to. If you have not seen The Great British Sewing Bee, where have you been? Are you even into sewing if you don't completely love that show? The idea of a scarf that's a quilt is kind of awesome. And I really want one. Welcome back to Shirty Deeds. My name's Jen. I like to talk about all things knitting and sewing. And if you've not been here before, you may not know that I have been on a bit of a journey so far this year trying to use up my stash and fabrics and things that I already own rather than shopping. So far at 2.5 months in, I have still not bought a single thing. It's going rather well. But I've been starting to have a think about what I'm going to do about all the little scraps. Larger scraps that just aren't big enough to make garments out of, and smaller, tiny, diddy scraps, all the little offcuts that you end up with whenever you sew stuff. I seem to have been saving them for years and years, waiting for the right projects to come along, and I'm hoping lots of them are going to be used up stuffing my closet core patterns poof that I'm going to make for our lounge. I've spoken about that in previous episodes. Link up here if you want to go check that out. But I think I'm still going to have loads left. And in the interests of not sending things to landfill, I need some scrap busting projects. And my aim with this is to make things that are genuinely useful or that I want in my life, that fit my style, that I want to give house room to. So things like scrunchies, which is a classic scrap busting idea that gets thrown about. It's just not something that I use. I don't really know anyone that would use those that I could give things like that away to. I'm not really into too much of a patchwork look, so piecing together fabrics to make clothing I find quite difficult. So I went trawling the internet, I've done the research so you don't have to, and I've found some scrap busting ideas that I think genuinely look beautiful and could be very, very useful. Let's get started. I have been thinking for a while that I might quite like a big piece of artwork to go on a very plain wall in my sewing room. Just to the left of me, there is a very plain, very white wall, and it is thus far unadorned, and I thought something colourful to bring some life into the room and inspire some creativity and colour in this space would be a good idea and something nice to have. And it makes sense in my sewing room to make some sort of wall art out of fabrics. And if you search for art quilts or art quilting, you find so many beautiful examples that people have made out of fabrics, scrap fabrics, etc. And I am certainly not a proficient quilter. I have done very little quilting in the past. But if you are an experienced quilter, I think you could make something really special as a wall hanging. So not as big as a quilt that you might put on your couch or on the bed, but something to hang on the wall and just be fabricy and beautiful and colourful and amazing. I have become slightly obsessed with this seller, I'm going to put some details up here, who has designed patterns for artistic quilts. They all come, you can print them out in various sizes. I think this sort of thing is probably a bit beyond me with my current quilting and accuracy skills, but I would like to build up to something like this. I think they're absolutely beautiful. I think they'd be perfect in the smaller sizes for making out of scraps. And I think for future years, this might be something I would really like to go for. The name of this particular designer is Style in Every Pattern. As I said, I'm going to leave links below to all of these things. Go check them out. There's loads of gorgeous ones. I'm only featuring a couple of different ones that particularly caught my eye here. In this same vein, I have found a much easier looking option for creating some homemade wall art. Now this is called Confetti quilting, and it basically requires you to cut up lots and lots of tiny bits of fabric in different colours and categorise your colours, and then arrange them in a particular picture or design onto face-up fusible interfacing. You lay out all your pieces, fuse them to that, and then quilt through them. Some people put a layer of tulle over the top to keep all the pieces contained while they're quilting everything. But I think I found some really beautiful examples of these and a brilliant tutorial that tells you all about how to do it. It seems a bit more accessible than the art quilting, which I just think is beyond my skill level, but I particularly like the way you can create a sort of almost impressionist image with this method. So that's something that I think I might like to give a try. The next thing that I would really like to see if I can have a go at is making some hats, specifically caps. Now, my husband is a big wearer of peaked caps. He particularly likes sort of trucker style or six-panelled caps, and I've got some pretty cool fabrics that I think I could make some really nice versions of these for him. And at first glance, a proper peaked cap with the proper brim seems a bit inaccessible, like something like it might be difficult to make or find the right materials for. And the first pattern that I found for this sort of thing is a fibre mood pattern, the Minu cap. I think this is probably more suited to women size-wise. I'm not sure whether it comes in various sizes, but they suggest that you make the brim with very stiff interfacing for this pattern. But I think my husband would want something obviously that's a man's fit and a men's sort of style of hat. And I think he would want a proper professional looking brim on his hat. He does like his clothes to look professionally made rather than anything even vaguely handmade. So I think if I was going to attempt something like this, I want to really try and do it properly. Anyway, on my journey around the internet, I found a company called Proper Fit Clothing. They've got a brilliant YouTube channel, and they design patterns for what I would call streetwear, like things that you would genuinely want to use. So they've got all sorts of like bags, accessories, and lots of different cap patterns. I really like the trucker cap version and the 6-panel hat that they do. Both of them have got quite a flat build sort of brim on them, which I know my husband quite likes, but there's lots of other designs that they've got patterns for, and they're really quite cheap. £2 or £3 for each pattern. They also recommend a company called the Cap Supply Company, who do kits where you can buy brims and sweatbands and all the internal components that you would add your fabric to make these sorts of hats. I have sat through one of Proper Fit Clothing's very long, detailed instructional videos on how you make one of these hats, and they have lots of industrial machines that do very specific parts of the process, but they also have a video on how to make some of these hats using a domestic machine to show that it's possible. So I think I might have a go at tackling this. I don't think it's going to be necessarily easy. I imagine parts of the process are going to be quite fiddly. Of course, this chap who sells clothes like this and makes things like this for a living is a professional. He's got professional equipment. He has made hundreds of these things, thousands I imagine, and he makes it look incredibly easy, of course. But I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility that someone with a bit of experience sewing could have a go at this. And I think I could make some really unique looking hats out of fabrics that I have. Now, in the past, I have made some handbags, tote bags, that kind of thing, out of larger pieces of scrap fabrics, and in some cases have quilted fabrics with wadding between the layers to give a bit of structure to those items, and I was really pleased with the results. But I was wondering how I might be able to use tinier little diddy scraps, and then remembered an episode of the Great British Sewing Bee. If you have not seen the Great British Sewing Bee, or where have you been? Are you even into sewing if you don't completely love that show? Episode 4 of series 10, I believe it is. Go look it up and have a watch if you haven't seen it. One of the challenges in their reduce, reuse, recycle week was to make a handbag out of tiny little scraps of fabric. So in a similar way to the confetti quilting that I was talking about earlier, you sandwich lots and lots of little pieces of fabric between layers of organza, sheer organza, and then quilt through it to create a kind of padded quilted fabric. And depending on the colours you use and whether you create ombre effects or fades of different colours, or whether it's just all a tutti frutti kind of mishmash of lots of colours, I think you can get quite creative with this. And it would use loads and loads of those tiny little scraps that you just don't know what else to do with but don't want to put in the bin. In order to do something like this, I would need to buy some organza fabric, but I could get a metre of organza fabric for £4 or £5, so it's not a big buy. And if it allowed me to use lots of bits of scraps, I would allow myself that purchase. I quite fancy making one of these bags. There is a pattern on the production company for that show's website, which I will pop a link for down there. So you can follow the exact design that they had to do as part of the competition on the show. But I think you could self-draft or use lots of different patterns for this. I mean, imagine doing this technique for a whole backpack or something. It would be epic. But even like beach bags, tote bags, things like that, I think you could use this method for lots of different styles of bags. I have heard from looking around the internet and seeing people's videos that it is quite difficult to get all your little pieces distributed evenly. So when you quilt through them, you get an even, uniform sort of fabric by the end in which to construct this bag with. But something that I'd quite like to have a go at, and without the time restrictions of the Sewing Bee programme, if you took your time, I think this would be a doable project. Sticking with the quilting vibe for just a few minutes longer, I would really like to make this year a hot water bottle cover. Not a regular hot water bottle cover, because I don't use the type that you put the water in. I have something called a hottie. I think the company might just be called Hottie, but they're these sort of weird chemical packs, a bit like a wheat bag, but a longer lasting chemical type version that you put in the microwave for 2 or 3 minutes. It heats it up and then it acts like a really long lasting hot water bottle. And I use this for various aches and pains I get with my bone condition. I find them really convenient. You don't have to wait for the kettle to boil, stick it in the microwave a couple of minutes and you've got a nice warm heating pad that stays hot for ages. And I've noticed that the cover on mine is starting to get a little bit raggedy because you end up kind of lying on them and the stitching's coming apart and it's not looking great. So I'd really like to make a quilted cover for this. It's going to be easier than doing one for a hot water bottle because it is square rather than the kind of bottle shape. So I'm going to be able to use the cover that is already on it to make templates for myself. I'd really like to make something quite cool looking, involving lots of different fabrics. And I, being quite lazy, tend to put the cover into the microwave with the hottie. I don't take it out. I put the whole lot in once. And I got a bit concerned that actually if I make a cover like this, I'm going to have to make sure it's safe to put in the microwave. So off I went doing a bit more research and discovered that you can do this as long as you make everything out of cotton. So I've got loads of different scrap cotton fabrics that I can use for this. And if I make sure that I use 100% cotton thread to sew it all with, and whatever wadding I use for the batting inside is either cotton wadding or something made out of natural fibres. I should be able to safely put this in the microwave and not have to take the whole thing out and then put it back in once it comes out the microwave. The whole reason for having this microwavable one is that it's really convenient for me. I'm going to pop up some examples of quilted hot water bottle covers that I've found that are non-twee, that I would give house room to. And some of these, I'm pretty sure they must be hand finished. They're from nice brands. Some of these are over £50 for a hot water bottle cover. The astonishing prices, and something that we as sewers can easily make ourselves. Not a very complicated project. And if you had an existing cover for your hot water bottle, you could easily use that as a template to trace around to get the size and shape of everything correct before you actually make the thing. The next thing I'd like to have a go at making at some point this year, if I have time, is some rope style placemats for our dining room. I'd really like some good looking placemats that I'll be proud to put out if we have people over to eat. And I think this has the potential for using up loads and loads of fabric. The basic idea of these is that you have a cord of some kind that you wrap in fabric along the length, coil it up, and as you're coiling it up you sew with a big zigzag stitch around, keep turning it, keep sewing it all together, and eventually you end up with a big disc like a placemat. You can also bring the sides up and make these into decorative bowls as well. I think this is really clever, and I've discovered a way that you can use even more scrap fabric for this and not have to buy any cord to act as the inner rope inside your fabric that's wrapped around it. I found another tutorial for making this kind of item out of jersey fabrics, and then instead of sewing it on a machine, you would use knitting yarn or crochet yarn to hand sew it round. And the cord is made up of jersey fabric, which, as we all know, if we've cut strips of jersey fabric, curls in on itself and creates like a tube. So several of these little tubes bundled together can act like your rope. And I wondered whether it would be a really amazing busting loads of scraps from the stash if I used leftover jersey fabrics as the core, as the rope, the cord, wrapped those in woven fabrics to make whatever colours I want these things to be, and then could sew round on the machine, or even use scrap yarn from my knitting to go round and hand sew it round. I think a set of 4 or 6 really nice handmade placemats would be a bit of a talking point if we had people over, something really special, and just something to add a bit of colour to our dining table when we sit down to eat. My last idea for scrap busting, which I think is a really cool idea, definitely ticks my non-twee box, is a scarf by Matchy Matchy, the sewing pattern company. It's called the Butter Quilt Scarf. And they also do like a blanket scarf, bigger version of this as well. But in the Butter Quilt Scarf, it comes with a pattern for a regular long sort of rectangular scarf, but also a triangular kind of neckerchief type design. And it's a pretty simple design. It's basically all made out of rectangles of fabric in a couple of different colours that you piece together like a quilt. Now, I don't know about you, I've not seen anything like this before, but the idea of a scarf that's a quilt is kind of awesome. And I really want one. I have lots of knitted scarves that I've knitted myself, and I've got various scarves that are left over from my non-sewing and knitting days. But the idea of having a quilted scarf, I don't know why I've never come across this before. I just think it's super cool. I think the version that they've done in the pictures is 2 colours. And for the long scarf, rectangular, regular style scarf version, you actually only need 75 centimetres of each fabric to make this thing. And I have got in my stash quite a lot of fabrics that are not really a metre, they're not really good for a garment, but I've probably got about 75 centimetres of length left of a fabric. So I could easily find 2 to combine. And actually you could cut the amount of fabric needed of each type down further, because you could do this in as many colours as you want. It doesn't have to be 2 colours in that alternate style like they suggest in the pattern pictures. I think you could use 3 or 4 or 5 colours and make this look really cool. You could use lots of different fabrics. I think if they were all a similar weight, you could get away with mixing different fibres and things. And I particularly like the way that, to keep the structure of it and to keep it all together, they've used almost like a hand stitching technique at various points along the scarf to keep it all together rather than quilting through it. So I think that will probably help maintain its soft, drapey sort of feel while you're wearing it. I think it would be really warm. I think you could really make a statement with a pattern like this and have a real show-stopping, very cool looking quilted scarf. I think when the cold weather starts rolling around again in the autumn, I'm going to start thinking about making something like this because I just love it. Just the very idea of a quilted scarf. Fabulous. So I hope you've enjoyed my little rundown of the things I found on my journey through the internet trying to find scrap busting projects. These are the things that caught my eye that I think are going to produce some beautiful things that are also useful, that I am willing to give house room to because they match the style of my house, the style of my wardrobe, etc. Hopefully this has given you a bit of inspiration for using up your scraps too. Watch this space. I expect some of these things might turn up in future videos in this stash busting series that I'm doing. Let me know in the comments what you think of these projects. You might have seen them all before. Maybe they're a little bit different from previous things that you've come across for using up scrap fabrics. I'd love to know what you think of my ideas. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel. It is lovely to have you all here. I'm so grateful. And give the video a thumbs up. We also like that too. I hope you enjoy all of your scrappy projects, your stash busting, your sewing, your knitting, if you're into that too. All the creative things that you're up to this week. And I will see you next time.